Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Podcast Coaching for Kingdom Entrepreneurs. I am your podcast coach, Kristen Chadwick, and I have another fellow podcast expert here with me today. Welcome to the show, Jerry Potter.
Thank you for having me, Kristen.
It's a joy to have you and to hear about your journey in podcasting and also giving us some tips, whether we're just starting a podcast or we're in the thick of it. So, before we begin, I would love for you to just do a little bio background on who you are, your podcast, and just a little tidbit of information before we get going.
Yeah, well, so right out of high school, I got into radio as a radio personality and programmer. And that's what I did for most of my life. That business has obviously evolved or devolved, some people would say. And and it got to the point where my wife and I hosted a show together, but we just weren't interested in moving around the country once we had young kids to continue in that. And so that's when I kind of looked for something else that I could do. And it was at that moment that I realized, with the help of some friends and mentors, that as a radio personality, I'd basically been a content marketer my whole life. This was about 2015. And everybody needed content all of a sudden. So
Yes.
it was an interesting mindset switch for me. But at the time, some people were like, well, why don't you just start a podcast? And I just thought, well, all the podcasters I know are broke and not growing and not able to monetize. Not all, but for the most part, right? Podcasting can be a challenge. And then some people say you should consult on podcasts. And at the time, I also insisted that podcasting and radio were not the same industry. They're both audio content, but there are a lot of differences. Like, for example, with radio, people are tuning in and out all the time, right? And you've got this marketing machine behind you. You have this 100,000-watt signal. Meanwhile, podcasts, people are intentional. They choose them. They show up. So they're very different mediums. And so even once I became an entrepreneur a couple of years later, I didn't even start my own podcast for a while for these same hesitations. But a couple of years ago, I saw my income in my business go down 70% in 4 months from the end of 2022 to the beginning of 2023. And I'll be honest, I'm not one of those people that's great at tracking numbers. I love somebody else to keep track of a spreadsheet for me. But this was substantial, right? You notice that in the bank account when you see those kind of drops. And so I started looking for a way to get people essentially nurtured and warmed up for my offers in a deeper way. And my mind kind of went back all of a sudden to radio and podcasting. And I was already doing YouTube, and it was like, oh, maybe it's time to bring these things together. So long story short, I didn't approach podcasting the way that most people approach podcasting. I approached it using what I've learned about YouTube, as well as what we did in radio when millions of dollars in ad revenue were on the line, to create what I think is an easier approach to podcasting, but also far more effective, especially for people that are running businesses.
Ooh, now this is going to get real interesting because I want to hear these methods that are unique, because I find it fascinating. One of the things that you say in your bio is how you were like, I'm not going to look at what all the other podcasters are doing because it's not working out well. And like you just shared in your story, I think that's so true for so many podcasters, that they're like, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with my podcast? It's not growing. It's not thriving. It's not bringing in finances. And I think so many people can relate to that. So I'm anxious to hear your unique approach to podcasting and how it's different and how that benefits us as podcasters.
Well, so when I started a podcast for my business, I've got a couple now, but the first one in recent years was called The 6 Ways, that I launched. And it was essentially, I'm a big believer that in business, there are 1,000 ways to do things and they all work. And so we don't all have to do things the way that whatever expert is saying, including me right now. Oh, you have to do things this way, right? We need to find the things that work for us. So it was called The 6 Ways, and every episode was 6 ways to take more time off without losing income, 6 ways to grow your business with a challenge, like just different things like that. So it was a fun passion project. I got to have a lot of good interviews. But when I set it up, I didn't go, okay, so I'm going to do the traditional podcast. I'm going to welcome my guest and I'm going to, and then we're going to go through and do the thing. I set it up like a radio show and I built it out of segments or modules. So we call in TV, sometimes you'll hear them call them segments, right? Like on morning TV shows, they'll be like, coming up in our next segment, what's going on in politics. And then after that, organic, gluten-free pizza snacks that your tween will love after school. They're jumping all over the place with all these different crazy things in their, quote segments. So we called them modules. We were on the air for 20 hours a week, right? Like 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. So it's not like we were going to come on and talk about the same thing all week. So the show was broken into these modules. Well, I took that approach to podcasting. Eventually we started calling it Modcasting. And so rather than, the typical podcast where it's kind of like, hey, welcome to the show. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Now we've talked about it. If you're interested in working with me, you can go do this. We broke it down into very strategic modules, and each module has a job, is the way that we like to talk about it, because we want to make your podcast the hardest working part of your business. So, you want to keep going? I don't want you to be like, oh my God, he's still talking. But
no, this is great. I think it's so fascinating. Yes.
Okay. So it's a different approach. And some people hear that and they go, wait, so now I got to create like 5 shows instead of 1 show. And it's not that. It's the way that we set the show up. So the typical show that we build or design has 5 modules. And by the way, if you are an existing podcaster, you can take your show and reformat it in this way, or you might just want to add the last module that we do, because that's the one that sometimes we call it, you're not supposed to say who your favorite kid is, but we call it our favorite module. Yeah, it's our favorite module. It's called the TSL module, and it's something inspired by radio, which I'll tell you about here in just a second. But, adding any of this can make a big, big difference. So we've designed it where some shows have more, but to start, you have 5 core modules. So it's not the first module, but the first module we talk about is the core content module. So this is your typical, like what is you were going to talk about in the podcast anyway. So here, us having this conversation, this would be your core content module of what we're doing in this episode. This is the reason that somebody listens. This is what the title is based on. All of that is tied to the core content. So that's still there. And the core content, if you're one of these podcasters with 2-hour podcasts, the core content might be 1 hour and 50 minutes, but the core content can also be 6 minutes or something like that. That's another reason we like this Modcasting formula, is for people that feel like, well, I can't talk about this really good topic because I don't have 20 minutes of stuff to say about it. When we build around the topic, as I'm going to talk about here in a second, now you can talk about really good stuff. I hate that in podcasts, people have this minimum length in their mind, like, I can't talk about that. It's not a whole episode. It's a tweet, but I can't do a whole episode about it, right?
Yes.
So that's that core content. That is the reason somebody's listening, and I think that's the important part to keep in mind when we start. Now, in order, we start the podcast with what we call the confirmation module. And the idea of the confirmation module is to confirm that the person listening is in the right place and that they want to be there. The goal of the confirmation module is to take somebody from listening to really wanting to listen and listen deep. I will tell you, I sometimes listen to podcasts while I'm washing dishes at night. I'm basically the person in my family who hates dishwashing the least, so I wash the dishes. And sometimes I'll start a podcast while I'm washing dishes and I'll go, oh, this is really good. I don't want to waste this on dishwashing. I'm going to save this until I can be more focused on it.
Yes.
So as a modcaster, that's what we want for every single episode. We want them to not just listen deeply, listen to the end, take that call to action. So sometimes people will open their podcast and they'll say, hey, in today's episode, we're going to talk about this. And then they jump right in. And I'm all for jumping right in. But with a confirmation module, we make that connection, show them the benefits, show them what they'll miss out on without listening, different things like that. We have a whole framework around it to really draw someone in. And so then your confirmation module can be, 30 seconds to even 2-3 minutes if you've got a really great story to tell or something like that.
Okay.
To be clear, the listener doesn't know this is going on.
Yes.
This is something that always comes. The listener's not like, oh, get into it already, because it's a really good piece of content by itself.
Yeah.
Then we go into what we call the vibe check module. This is what's typically known as a podcast intro. Do you have an intro for your
I
show?
do. Mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the podcast intro is doing something slightly different than the confirmation module. The confirmation module is to help them believe that this is the episode they should be listening to right now, right? It's about that episode.
Mm.
The vibe check, which my wife Candy named, she's like,
I
it's to
love
check
it.
the vibe in the room. I'm like, okay, we can call it the vibe check, but it's to help a new listener or maybe somebody who hasn't listened in a while or hasn't listened to more than a couple of episodes to understand the overall vibe of the show.
Mm.
Okay. This can be done live or it can be a produced thing. If you do video, I'm big on doing these produced because, if a lot of times with the objection to video podcasting for audio podcasters is like, who wants to just sit there and
Right.
watch me talk about my thing, right? And we should talk about video, but
I would love it.
okay, so let's come back to video. But the nice thing is you can, one time produce a video intro for your podcast. And then if somebody is watching it on YouTube or if you add video to Spotify, it gives us a little bit more production value.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the rest of it is just somebody staring at us talking,
Right. Yes.
So then we go into that core content module like we talked about. Now, the one after that, the fourth module, so we have the confirmation, vibe check, core content. The one after that, for anyone who has a business, or even if your podcast is becoming a business, is the most important module of the whole thing. It is the reason that you're doing the show outside of maybe a passion for it or a love for it.
Right.
And we call that the conversion module. Now, most podcasts have a call to action of some sort at the end. Some podcasts, have 17 calls to action at the end. Hey, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow and subscribe and share with a friend and leave a review and,
Yes.
and name your firstborn after me. There's all these different things. So what we do is we have what we call the conversion module, and it is a step up from the call to action. If you are a business owner with a podcast or your podcast is becoming the business, that thing you ask them to do is the most important part of the whole thing, right? That's where you get them to join your email list or buy a product or whatever else it might be. So we call it the conversion module, and it goes deep on what you want them to do. It is never a throwaway. Now, a lot of the times when I've consulted with podcasters, they've said, well, I don't want them to stop listening. So I just say, hey, if you're interested in working with me, check out the link in the show notes, right? You've heard this in podcasts,
Yes.
I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I like to share this story from when I was in radio. We had this contest we would play on our morning radio show every day. We did it in multiple cities around the US, and it was called Can't Beat Candy. My wife is Candy, and we did the show together, and she is a pop culture news junkie, right? So she knows everything about everything.
Okay.
So the way it would work is a listener would get on the phone and we'd send Candy out of the studio. We'd ask the listener 5 questions. Then we'd bring Candy back in, ask her the same 5 questions. If you could tie or beat Candy, you'd win. But she was so good at it that they didn't very often. Well, the company brought in this really, probably crazy expensive consultant to work with us on the show. And we're sitting in the meeting, and it's our boss, Candy and I, and this consultant who they'd flown into Seattle from LA. And she said, how's Can't Beat Candy going? And I said, well, it's fine. We played early in the morning. It was like 6:12 in the morning. Not that many people call to play, or not as many as I think should. Maybe because we do it too early, or maybe because our prizes aren't good enough. Like if we could get some better prizes. I was doing something I don't do anymore as an entrepreneur because I can't, and that was blame everything but myself.
Oh, yes.
Right? Because as entrepreneurs, we can't. I mean, we can to an extent, but and so she said, "Well, I listened to it yesterday." And you asked people to call and play the contest. I said, yeah. And she said, what if you took longer to do that? So I was literally like, hey, time to play Can't Beat Candy, 5 pop culture questions. If you can tie or beat Candy, you win this prize. Call now. Here's the phone number. Like it was like 7 seconds.
Okay.
And she goes, what would happen if you took, 20 seconds to explain it? And I looked at my boss and I'm like, oh, they tell us we have to do everything really quick and get back to the music and all that. So she just very calmly, like a good coach or consultant does, turns to my boss and says, would it be okay if for the next week they spent 20 whole seconds for their call to action for this contest? And he said, yeah, that's totally fine. The next morning I go in at 6:12, and instead of spending 7 seconds, I spent 20 seconds asking people to call.
Mm.
The phone lines lit up. We had 10 phone lines all flashing. We got the contestant on the phone. They kept all flashing. We already got a contestant, answer.
Yeah.
We already got a contestant. They just kept calling. The contest aired on the radio. People still kept calling. 40 minutes later, people were still calling to play this contest
Wow.
for some crap prize because I actually slowed down and explained how to do it.
Okay.
We don't do this as podcasters. We say throwaway things like, by the way, if you want this free thing, I've got it. You can go get it in the show notes, right? We do this all the time. And the thing I like to remind podcasters of is if someone has gotten to that point of your episode, they are happy. They're not mad.
Mm-hmm.
They got through your core content. They liked all of it. They enjoyed themselves, or they would have bailed a long time ago. So you are doing them a disservice to throw away that next thing that's designed to help them, right?
Yeah.
And it was the same thing with the radio contest, and it's the same thing here. So the conversion module, which we have a framework for as well, but the conversion module, if you do nothing else, slow down, take your time, really sell it as though you're selling $1,000 offer, even if it's something that's free. Because at this point, if I would much rather have 90% of the people bail on the episode and 10% of the people take action than have nobody bail and 1% of the people take action.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. So, all right. Any questions about that so far?
No, this is great. This is great. Yes.
Okay. I see you taking notes, so I just wanted to double check. So the last module of our core 5 modules, and we have other ones we work with clients sometimes, but the last module of our core 5 modules is called the TSL module. This is our favorite module. When we were in radio, there was two things we were rated on. We were rated on the number of people listening overall. So we would be on 5:30 to 10 a.m. and we could look at the rating and say, okay, 500,000 people listened to the show last week. And then we were also rated on how long they listened. So that's time spent listening, or TSL for short.
Okay.
So we call it this because it's designed to get people listening longer.
Okay.
And it serves 3 purposes. So first, what is the TSL? The TSL is a quick piece of related content at the end of the episode that it can stand on its own. So, for example, if I was doing an episode about, like I did an episode of my podcast done by Lunch Entrepreneurs, I think it was 7 things I'd do differently if I was starting over on YouTube now. And at the end, I would do an additional segment that was and I think I actually did this. I'm trying to remember now. You know what it's like, right? When you create all these episodes. What did I say exactly? But it was 2 things I would do the same, even though most people don't do these 2 things.
That's awesome.
So a couple things happen here. First of all, they get the core content, right? The core content module. Then they get that conversion module. And rather than tuning out because you're asking them to do something, they stay because they want to hear the 2 things that you would do the same, even though most people don't do these on YouTube. So that's one thing it does, is it gets people to stay till the end of the episode. And more importantly, through the conversion module. But the other thing that we do with this is we turn it into its own piece of content, generally a short form video, that then you can put out on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. These are all platforms that reach people who don't know who you are yet. Okay. Most of social media is just barely reaching your followers, right? Like, oh, I worked so hard. I got 500 followers and 13 of them saw that post. Thanks, Facebook. I appreciated that. But short form videos, these vertical videos, are actually being shown to people who don't follow you yet.
Yeah.
And so then it also, not only does it keep people listening, gets people to hear the conversion module, which is the main thing we want, but then it also brings new people into the show because we pull it out. And it's not like going back to your podcast later and going, oh gosh, what could I pull out? I don't know. Is there anything good? Is there a good clip here? And these AI tools are getting better at finding stuff. You already know it's going to be pulled out ahead of time. And so then you pull it out and put it out there. And just to give you an example, some of these clips, I had one clip that I put up as an Instagram reel, and I think it's reached over 40,000 people.
Wow.
I have 4,000 followers on Instagram, roughly. Okay. So it's in front of all these new people. But my favorite part of that specific example is I had a lot of new people say, oh, saw this reel, started listening to the show.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great.
Yes.
Like the podcast is growing. One woman signed up for one of my programs and invested $1,000 to work with me in this program for a year. And we have a thing like a lot of us do where it's like, hey, where did you find out about Jerry Potter? And she said, I saw this reel on Instagram and then looked into you. And when I spoke to her, I said, so did you then go listen to the podcast episode or like what happened? And she goes, no, I never even listened to the podcast episode. I just saw that clip and then I went to your website and I just, and
Wow.
so I always share that as, the way I made $1,000 from a podcast episode from someone who never even heard it.
Yes, that's amazing.
So that's the high level overview of Modcasting. But we, like I said, each module has a job and they all work together to get more people listening, get them to listen longer, and get them to do the thing you want them to do at the end, and bring new people in on a consistent basis.
This is great and such a great idea too. I think for me, for a long time, I mean, I've been in podcasting since 2016 as well, in various roles, and so, but my heart has always had this hunger to sound like NPR in some way, like that narrative thread that goes in and out. For instance, This American Life, that is my all-time favorite. I mean, that got me hooked on storytelling in radio and like a
Yes.
common theme.
Yeah.
But I've always struggled with like, how do we break out of this mold of here's the intro, we go into the content, and then we leave with a call to action, and then we're done. But how do we really bring in some almost like dynamic education, entertainment, just a little bit of creativity in there. And I think that's what it brings to the table is if you have these modules where it is like little segments, you can almost do that pretty well. Like people like, This American Life, where it is one common thread, but different stories and different modules throughout.
Yeah. And that's one of the keys is you do want it, because sometimes people say, oh, so I would do a module about knitting and then I would do a module about horseback riding. And it's like, well, no. Because one of the important things to remember is, when I talked about how that core content module, that's the reason for the title, the reason somebody clicks, the reason somebody's listening. Once you get somebody there, we want them to stay. And once they have clicked, we already know who they are. There's somebody who wants to hear about that topic. And so that's why throughout we keep it, like you said, on that same thread. And I'll tell you another thing too, when I coach people about converting more on their podcasts. Or if I do an audit of somebody's show, a lot of times it's like, all right, in this episode, we'll use podcasting as an example. In this episode, it's 3 ways to get more leads from your podcast. And then they get to the call to action, or what we call the conversion module. And they say, by the way, if you're thinking about maybe having a new website built, here's this great tool that I've used, right? And you're walking into a room of people who have all said they want to get more leads from their podcast, and then you're asking them to do something different. And so of course it's not going to convert as high.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Have that alignment for sure. Yeah. And what an easy on-ramp of like, oh, well, I can offer something that matches with that and bring people in to that newer level of engagement versus just listening. Now they're inside of your newsletter or your whatever it is that you're funneling them into. So
exactly. Yeah.
Oh man, this is real fun. Like my creative juices are flowing, and I'm thinking of lots of my podcasters and how they can implement this.
Well, and let me say real quick too, I know that you have an audience of aspiring podcasters, but also a lot of existing podcasters. And sometimes this is like, okay, wait, I got to redesign the whole show. Like when I first started looking into, I wasn't going to like teach this, I was just doing it, but then people kept asking, but I did a little market research, right? Like we do. And I found that a lot of podcasters, no one listening, obviously, but are very stubborn and set in their ways, and they've got their routine, and they're not going to change anything, right?
Yes.
And so some of them told me this, but if nothing else, you can just add that TSL module onto the end, and you will get, without disrupting anything else,
Yeah.
And you'll get people listening longer, listening closer, listening to your call to action or conversion module. And if you can pull it out as a clip, you'll be able to bring new people in. So that one alone, that's why it's our favorite. Added on to any existing podcast can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, and that's so helpful because the last thing I want to do is overwhelm anybody who's just getting started or is in their rhythm of this is how I produce a show. But I love that there is the TSL that we could put in there as a separate, but similar to your content piece where it's adding even more value. Yeah, I love that. Well, okay, we said we were going to come back to video, and I love that we're going to talk about this because I know there's definitely differing opinions out there on podcasting and whether you should have video or not have video.
Yeah.
I definitely am one. I used to be pure like audio is the way of podcasting, but I have seen such a huge growth like you. I've had in my own experience where I've had clients come in from video and
Yeah.
they didn't listen to the podcast either. And they found me just by Googling or YouTube searching, a Christian podcast coach and boom, there I came. And then there came a client. So it does work. And I've seen it work multiple times with clients who are all in with video. So with that question or with that story, my question for you is what have you seen is working in 2025 as far as video? What's not working, and any advice there?
So if you had to choose to podcast in audio or video, I could see making the argument of, I'm going to go with audio. It's intimate. It's probably like all the great things about audio, right? When I was in radio, sometimes people would see me in public, when our show was more popular and act like they knew me. And I was like, what, why do you care who I am? Like, it was so weird. But it was after I was out of radio, I started listening to this podcast and I was just like, oh my God, this woman's amazing. I want to meet her. I want to hang out with her. Like I finally got it.
You're my best friend.
It's very intimate, right? They're usually listening in headphones or in their car by themselves.
Yeah.
So that connection is really, really powerful. But in 2025, it's not that hard to do audio and video. And I'm sure that's met with skepticism, which I'll address in a second. But YouTube was recently named the #1 platform for podcast discovery. And when I said earlier, I got out of radio and I didn't want to start a podcast because all the podcasters I knew were broke and they weren't growing. That has always been the hardest part about growing a podcast. And the biggest advice on the internet is just keep publishing. You don't worry about growth until you get to 200 episodes or, whatever it was. Like, just keep going. And I love that optimistic spirit. But now with YouTube and being able to pull out video clips, we have a way to grow. So why not take advantage of that? And I've talked to some podcasters where they say, well, I love to just put on my sweats and record my episodes and it doesn't matter what I look like. So what I always say is, all right, here's what you got to do. You got to get camera ready once a month. Once a month, take a shower.
Once a month.
Once a month, take a shower, record your 4 episodes, and then you can skip showering for the next 29 days if you want. Totally fine, okay? But the other part of this that I found with a lot of audio podcasters that I interviewed when I was researching this is they were so proud of their audio-only podcast and recording with a hat on or, no makeup or sweats or whatever it might be. But then they turned around and they recorded all of this social media content. And so what I found was that these audio-only podcasters were actually spending more time and getting camera ready, whatever that means for each of us, more than video podcasters. And the way that we teach this modcasting idea and the whole modcasting blueprint, part of that is, pulling out that TSL module to grow your show, but also pulling out other aspects, other modules or parts of modules that become all your social media content. So ultimately what we show people how to do is to do this whole thing and, in about an hour a week, have a show that becomes all your social media content as well. And thanks to editing tools like Descript, and the fact that people are open to less polished content and, all of these things now, it really can be done. People say, well, what about editing? How long does it take you to edit your podcast? And I play with different things because I'm a tech geek and I'm experimenting all the time. But the basic edit, I basically hired my friend's daughter to edit. She had no video editing experience, and she would edit each episode in Descript in about 10 minutes. So it's just, we've gotten to the point now where it's so much easier and faster to do all of that.
Yeah.
And if you are hesitant about getting on camera, believe me, I get it. I was very much there.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, Kristen, the trust acceleration that comes from video is on a whole new level. And as I think AI content gets bigger and bigger, like AI generated content, I think it's going to be even more important for somebody who is a genuine person, maybe even broadcasting in a semi-cluttered home, something that AI would never generate, or whatever it might be, to build that trust.
That is true. I haven't even thought about that with the AI voice. And yeah, it does establish that trust of like, oh, you're a real person bringing real stories. This has been so helpful, Jerry. I just have really, like, it sparked some creativity in my own content creation ideas, and I can't wait to just sit with it. And I know that the podcasters that are listening right now are pontificating on their own module type podcast, and I know some of them too are going to be like, Jerry, how do I find out more? I want to know about the frameworks, like every module. Can you tell me and walk me through that? So where can people connect with you?
Well, if you want to learn more specifically about Modcasting and kind of how to put this together, I have a free masterclass that's available on demand. You can just go to our website, which is donebylunch.co, DONEBYLUNCH, just like it sounds, .co. And you can sign up for that there anytime. And I teach pretty openly about how the whole thing works. It's actually called 3 Secrets to a Successful Podcast on YouTube, but it's all about podcasting and saving time and stuff like that. And then the reason, I probably should have mentioned this up front, the reason it's Done by Lunch is overall in my business, we help people run their online business in half the time so they can theoretically be done by lunch, move on to other things that give them purpose and joy, whether that's more time with family or their health or volunteering or whatever it might be. And so my podcast is called Done by Lunch, and you can get that, Done by Lunch Entrepreneurs, and you can get that at donebylunchpodcast.com.
Awesome. Man, I want to be done by lunch. That sounds great.
You know what? It's all about building with high leverage assets, and podcasts is one of those, right?
Yes,
You start a podcast, and as your audience grows and you get better at it, it becomes less work. But you're building this evergreen library of content that can bring new people into your world all the time. And that is, from what I've found, I for years, some of my clients were like, how do you get so much done? And I'd be like, oh, let me tell you about my content batching and calendar hacks. And I realized it's not that at all. It's using high leverage assets like podcasts and YouTube. That's what allows you, because it's so high leverage. You can just build this stuff, and then over time it gets stronger and stronger.
So good. You guys, you can see that Jerry is a wealth of knowledge, and go check out his podcast, because there is more where that all came from. You guys, I am so excited that you have heard this today, and I want to hear from you too, of how is this going to shift how you create your podcasts. And if you want to join me in watching this free masterclass, let me know. Send me a message on Instagram or on Facebook. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback too, and we'll swap notes. All right. Happy podcasting, and I will see you next time.